The 13th of July, 2008. A small and newly established US outpost at Wanat, within the Waygal Valley of Nuristan province, Afghanistan, was being defended by soldiers from both the United States and Afghanistan's armed forces. They were routinely going about their watch. Little did they know they would soon find themselves in the midst of one of the most significant battles against Taliban insurgent fighters on Afghan soil. A surprise attack would soon be launched, resulting in severe US losses and a great degree of scrutiny on how things could have been done differently. In today's video, we will be exploring the infamous Battle of Wanat in detail, looking at the key events leading up to, during, and after this conflict. Welcome to Wars of the World. Back to school shopping may be behind most of us, but that feeling of starting fresh each autumn still lingers. For me, part of that reset comes with the gear I use every day, like Raycon's Everyday Earbuds Classic. They've become a constant companion when I'm working, researching, or simply unwinding, making routines feel smoother and more focused. Raycon's Everyday Earbuds Classic are designed with real practical upgrades. They feature active noise cancellation, which blocks out distractions when I need to focus, and multi-point connectivity, which lets me switch seamlessly between devices. Their ergonomic fit means they stay secure no matter what I'm doing. They also come in a range of colors. Personally, I'm drawn to the cool mint. It's subtle but distinctive, and far from the generic look of other earbuds. Functionality, though, is where these earbuds shine. With up to 32 hours of battery life with the case, a quick charge feature that delivers 90 minutes of playtime in just 10 minutes, and awareness mode, which lets me stay alert to what's happening around me without giving up sound quality. Raycon matches the sound quality of the big premium brands, but without the inflated price tag. That's why over 3 million people already use them, backed by a 30-day happiness guarantee. For me, I use them daily, and I think you'll find they fit seamlessly into your routine as well. So if you'd like to support our channel and upgrade your audio, click the link in the description or go to buyraycon.com/warsoftheworld to get 20% off site-wide. That's buyraycon.com/warsoftheworld for 20% off. The remote base targeted by the Taliban in July of 2008 was not a large or significant one. It existed primarily as an observation post, keeping a close watch on any Taliban activity in the Waygal district of Afghanistan. Situated close to the Pakistan border, they could disrupt any supplies that would be traveling through to Taliban fighters from the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan, and they would frequently patrol the area in search of potential threats. Moreover, at the time of the attack, this base had only been established for a few days. Much of the terrain surrounding the base consisted of farmland and mountains, and while visibility was good, it was situated essentially in the middle of nowhere. The closest camp was roughly 5 miles away, the US Camp Blessing. 48 United States soldiers were stationed at the newly set up base at the time of the attack. They were primarily with the 2nd Platoon Chosen Company, 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team. Accompanying them were 24 Afghan soldiers that assisted the US forces with patrolling the area. Despite the remote location of the base, combat was common in the surrounding area, and in the weeks and days running up to the Battle of Wanat, a series of events at nearby sites set the stage for soldiers to be on high alert in the region. It was these events that would lead them to set up the base at Wanat. On the 4th of July 2008, reports came in that the nearby forward observation base, Bella, was being targeted by small arms fire throughout the course of a relocation procedure that spanned for several days. During the relocation, which saw soldiers at Bella relocated to the new site at Wanat, the FOB was vulnerable, and the reports turned out to be true. Taliban forces had attacked, attempting to block a 19th Engineer Battalion squad that was waiting to be relocated. This resulted in a series of brief attacks by the Taliban, but US forces were prepared. Private First Class Jason Vales, Randall Durry, and Todd Weil, along with Staff Sergeant Todd Barfield and Specialist Benjamin Bond, were able to deter the Taliban from the base over the course of a few short skirmishes. Artillery fire from the nearby Camp Blessing helped them repel the attackers. But this wasn't the end for the US soldiers on guard. Intelligence was received that Taliban forces would attempt to overrun the camp from within, but thankfully this did not occur. This preliminary attack on the nearby FOB Bella was believed to be a retaliation in response to an incident earlier that day, when a US Army helicopter had attacked a series of Taliban vehicles and what they claimed was an act of defense, as the fighters reportedly opened fire. The helicopter's fire would leave 17 people dead, one of which was reported to have been a Taliban commander. These events caused the US Army to establish and reinforce the base at Wanat over the coming days, which would theoretically disrupt Taliban activity in the area significantly. Their goal was to create a base that could serve as a means of intercepting resources bound for Taliban forces near the Pakistan border. Unfortunately, as we will soon see, this did not go to plan. On the 8th of July, the Wanat base will be reinforced with a platoon of soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team. They initially established the basic vehicle patrol base Kala, as well as a nearby observation base to track any enemy activity in the region. Camp Blessing would soon send 5 M1114 armoured Humvees to the base at Wanat. 3 of these would transport the infantry's rifle squads. One was designed for platoon headquarters, and the other contained a BGM-71 TOW anti-tank missile squad to reinforce the base. The Humvees themselves were also reinforced with weaponry. 2 of them were loaded with 50 caliber machine guns, while the other 2 carried MK-19 40mm automatic grenade launchers. With the initial firepower in place, the soldiers got to work establishing the site that would, theoretically, be supported by a new US Army unit within 2 weeks' time. The base sat in the middle of a large field, with buildings on 2 sides belonging to the nearby settlement of Wanat. The following day, a construction crew arrived by helicopter and began reinforcing the base with sandbags, razor wire, bastions, and a firing pit for a 120mm Saltum K6 mortar. However, problems occurred from the start. The Bobcat loader that was brought in to lift and place the barriers broke down for a day, which meant that the barriers in question, intended on being over 2 meters or 7 feet tall, only reached just over 1 meters or 4 feet tall. This was a major problem. The base was now worryingly vulnerable to gunfire, which the US soldiers knew that any Taliban fighters in the area would be able to exploit. Trenches and ditches to house weapons and soldiers during combat would need to be dug out manually, and time was of the essence. Recent Taliban activity in the area meant that an attack could come at any second, and it became more and more obvious that the base was just not suited for its intended purpose. Some parts of the base were essentially undefended, with no posts or stakes to construct defensive walls. Barbed wire was stretched out on the ground, affording little to no protection against Taliban fighters if they did arrive. Intelligence estimates stated that the number of men and degree of protection at the Wanat base would be enough to defend them from the attack if the Taliban did descend upon them, but this proved to be a major underestimate soon enough. Concerning warning signs were reported from within the Wanat base on the day of the attack, the 13th of July 2008. Soldiers working on the construction of the base reported groups of men watching and gesturing towards the base amongst the buildings from the nearby village of Wanat, while others cited men moving through the adjacent mountains, occasionally stopping to observe the base. The night before, when some of the US soldiers had headed into Wanat to eat, they were advised to kill anybody they see moving around in the mountains. Only Taliban fighters had a reason to be up there. The attack came early, at 20 past 4 in the morning of the 13th. Utilizing the element of surprise, around 200 Taliban fighters had come together to strike at the base, and they took steps to plan ahead to minimize the time that US forces had to respond. The night before they advanced, they began flowing water across an irrigation system in a neighboring field, which created enough background noise that the Americans would not be able to hear them moving through the field towards the Wanat base. The Taliban fighters were armed to the teeth, with machine guns, RPGs and mortar fire. Allegedly, 100 fighters advanced on the front of the base, while another 100 snuck around to the side of the observation post to the east, using the cover of the mountains to make their attack while it was still dark. Within a few minutes of the Taliban advancing on the Wanat base, they had managed to take out the Americans' 120mm mortar and the ammunition to go with it that would have been used against them. This created a sizable explosion as the mortar ammo was detonated, rendering one of their most valuable assets useless. Taliban fighters wielding rocket launchers managed to destroy the Tau missile launcher mounted on one of the armoured Humvees, which blocked off access to the US's second heaviest weapon. In the blink of an eye, the Taliban had gained a terrifying upper hand as a result of their guerrilla tactics and stealth. Following this, the Taliban set their sights on attacking soldiers directly. They first focused their fire on the observation post, manned by a team known as Topside. This consisted of Sergeant Ryan M. Pitts and his specialists, Tyler Stafford, Gunnar Swilling, Matthew Phillips, Chris McCaig, Jason Bogar, and Pruitt Rainey. Also present was Corporal Jonathan Ayres. The Taliban's first round of fire managed to wound every one of these soldiers, catching them off guard as they scouted the hills and fields from the observation point. During that first wave of gunfire, the Taliban fighters launched a rocket-propelled grenade that managed to send Tyler Stafford flying from his mounted machine gun. He and Matthew Phillips then started to throw grenades at the insurgents, who had managed to infiltrate the base. But Phillips soon found himself on the receiving end of Taliban machine gun fire, which would eventually lead to his death. Phillips was not the only one who would lose his life that day, however. Within the first 20 minutes of the battle, 4 US soldiers had died. Corporal Jason Bogar grabbed his machine gun and fired towards the Taliban head-on, but his gun unfortunately jammed. Seeing that Stafford had been launched from his post, he headed over to administer first aid behind cover while the fighting continued. Bogar then managed to kill several Taliban fighters who were firing upon them from atop the Wanat village hotel, but he was soon killed when he left the borders of the base to take out more. Sergeant Ryan M. Pitts soon found himself alone at the observation post as his men died or became separated from him one by one, but he was able to hold them off on his own. Firing periodically from cover, whilst attempting to contact Allied forces to evacuate him and his remaining men, he managed to hold his position for a grueling 2 hours until help finally arrived. Back at the main base, hell was unfolding as the Taliban rained fire from the adjacent field, Wanat village, and from within the base itself. The US soldiers had burst into life as they desperately defended both themselves and their comrades, firing their machine guns and launching grenades into the field to take out as many Taliban insurgents as possible. They managed to radio in support from the nearby Camp Blessing, who showered the field with 96 155mm artillery rounds, killing multiple fighters. All the while, soldiers at the Wanat base were attempting to drag their wounded to safety, while others ran directly through Taliban fire to resupply the post with ammunition and resources. The soldiers used claymore mines to stop the Taliban from entering their base, and although some did manage to breach the poorly defended borders, they were eventually repelled from entering. When the Allied forces eventually came to evacuate the soldiers, Pitts was able to hold his position as the last man standing. Slowly, US soldiers were taken to safety, but heavy losses had been suffered. Pitts himself was seriously injured and did extremely well to escape with his life by the end of the battle. The Taliban fighters had used a variety of tactics to get a clear shot on the US soldiers at Wanat. They fired upon the remaining Humvees, causing the soldiers who were defending them to run out into the open in order to avoid being shot. They would also periodically throw rocks behind cover into the walls of the base. The US soldiers, whose vision was obscured by the darkness of the Afghan countryside, had no way of telling that these projectiles weren't actually grenades, and so they ran out from behind the safety of their cover to avoid being killed by these pseudo-grenades. This, in turn, led to the Taliban being able to shoot and kill several men across the course of the battle. While the soldiers waited for their evacuation, support came in the form of missile strikes and helicopter fire. Roughly half an hour after the fighting began, AGM-114 Hellfire missiles rained down upon the field, killing several Taliban insurgents, fired from an unmanned MQ-1 Predator drone. AH-64 Apache attack choppers singled out individual fighters, spraying them with bullets from a 30mm M230 chain gun. Soldiers on the ground were provided with ammunition dropped in by UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, while evacuation support helped the wounded retreat to Camp Wright, out of the range of the fighting. The Taliban continued the assault for 4 grim hours, and they were finally routed when additional air support, in the form of a B-1B Lancer bomber, an A-10 Thunderbolt II, and an F-15E Strike Eagle were called in. Under such heavy fire, the Taliban could not continue the assault, and when Pitts was evacuated, the base was left abandoned. Further operations would see US forces sweep their way into Wanat, the mountains, and the neighbouring towns where Taliban forces had fled after the Battle of Wanat. It became impossible for the insurgents to maintain their position with such heavy presence of US firepower, and so they withdrew from Wanat and the surrounding areas following the harrowing night of fighting. Nine US soldiers had lost their lives in the Battle of Wanat, most of whom were manning the observation post that was attacked quickly and stealthily by the Taliban fighters. Those who died were the following: Specialist Sergio S. Abad, Corporal Jonathan R. Ayers, Corporal Jason M. Bogar, Sergeant Israel Garcia, Corporal Jason D. Hoverter, Corporal Matthew B. Phillips, Corporal Pruitt A. Rainey, Corporal Gunnar W. Zwilling, and First Lieutenant Jonathan Brostrom. The soldiers would later report that between 21 and 65 of the theorized 200 Taliban insurgents who had assaulted the base were killed in the fighting. When subsequent authorities reached the site, however, they found only the bodies of 2 Taliban fighters in the immediate proximity of the base. In the aftermath of the battle, an unnamed Afghan Defense Ministry official, in an interview with Al Jazeera, had said that between 400 and 500 Taliban fighters had been part of the attack that day. The Battle of Wanat was the bloodiest for US forces since the Battle of Abbas Ghar, or Operation Red Wings, 3 years prior. The reason that such a large number of Taliban forces were thought to be able to attack the base was due to Taliban sympathizers amongst the Waygal region, following a series of civilian casualties in the previous weeks and months. The lack of supplies and defense structures at the Wanat base also allowed the Taliban to set their sights on a higher number of US soldiers than usual. Soon after the Battle of Wanat, US Army commanders of coalition troops in Afghanistan would opt to abandon the Wanat patrol base. 3 days later, there were no permanent American forces left in Wanat at all, but they continue to send patrols to the region to help prevent such conflicts from taking place again. 1 month later, on the 13th of August, a US Army investigation into the events of the battle was undertaken, and this was made public in the following November. The investigation discovered that Taliban forces were being assisted by local Afghan authorities, such as district leaders and local police. Weapon and ammunition stocks, much larger than necessary for the village's 20-strong police force, were unearthed in the barracks. And what's more is that these weapons seem to have been very recently used. The investigation also brought to light potential intelligence that the US Army should have expected an oncoming assault before it had happened. Ultimately, however, the investigation deemed that the base commanders in Wanat should not have expected any form of assault, despite the fact that there were reports of Taliban forces amassing in the surrounding hills for weeks prior to the battle. In 2009, Colonel Charles Preisler, Lieutenant Colonel William Osland, and Captain Meyer were issued letters of reprimand off the back of the poorly planned construction work that would see Taliban fighters gain better access to the base. A later investigation by a US Marine Corps Lieutenant General, Richard F. Natonsky, would relieve these officers of their blame, stating that they were, quote, neither negligent nor derelict in the performance of their duties, exercising a degree of care that a reasonably prudent person would have exercised under the same or similar circumstance. End quote. Meyer was later awarded a Silver Star Medal, the third highest military decoration for combat, for his role during the battle. By June 2010, each of the officers' reprimands had been revoked, and no criminal action was pursued. However, this did not sit well with the family members of the soldiers that had been killed in action at Wanat. Letters were written to the Secretary of the US Army asking that Natonsky's investigation should be reopened and that the officers' reprimands should be reinstated. Several senators signed the letter in support, but no further action was taken. An official historical account of the Battle of Wanat was published by the CSI in November 2010, and it blames the high death toll on the uncertainty of war, mistakes made by inexperienced military officers, a lack of intelligence, and a lack of knowledge about the complexities of the Wanat region's political situation. On the 21st of July 2014, Ryan M. Pitts was awarded with the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States, for his actions in defending his comrades and holding his position while evacuation support was carried out at the Battle of Wanat. He had been medically discharged from the US military in 2009 and lives to tell the terrifying tale of the Battle of Wanat today. The Battle of Wanat serves as an unsettling reminder that the tides can turn in mere minutes on the battlefield, even with the advanced technology of modern warfare in the 21st century. It must have been a truly horrifying experience to go from 0 to 100 in a mere instant, as gunfire and explosions unfold around you in an isolated field in Afghanistan. But the actions of Pitts and his comrades ensured that the Taliban soon withdrew from Wanat. Through his brave defense of the base, Pitts saw that no further life was lost that day.